The criminal that we decided to do our presentation on's name is Betty Broderick, and our group members are Natalie Peters, Olivia Rosenberg, and Morgan Williams. So before we wanted to go into the theory, we decided to kind of talk about what led to this crime. So for some background on Betty Broderick, I sort of broke down Betty and Dan and how they met, and then like their marriage breakdown when they were actually together. So Betty and Dan, first starting with Betty, her parents were devout Roman Catholics, and her goal, which was pretty clear in a lot of the sources that we found, was that she wanted to be a good wife. She wanted to be like her mother. So Betty first met Dan at a party in 1965 at University of Notre Dame in Indiana, actually. They did not get married too long after, April 12th, 1969. So that's when they first got married. And then right after the honeymoon, almost immediately after, she was pregnant with their first child, Kim. So they had former children later on by the names of Lee, Daniel, Rhett, and then they also had another boy who actually died not too long after birth. So Betty looked after their children while Dan actually went to Harvard Law School to become an attorney. This was after he already went to medical school, so he was already pretty busy with his life, just like going to school, and she was the one working, and she was the one taking care of the kids all the time, while, he went even back to school to become an attorney. So he eventually got enough money for Betty to become a housewife, which is actually what she always wanted. Like I said before, she wanted to be a good wife. She wanted to be a good mother, and she wanted to just take care of her children. And after he got all that money, he hired an assistant, and her name was Linda. So kind of a marriage breakdown when they were more, involved with like their children, and like they had their house and everything. Betty suspected that this assistant, Linda, Dan was having an affair with her. But Dan, of course, continued to deny this. Betty then damaged Dan's property when she found out that he had spent his 38th birthday with Linda when she had been waiting at his office for hours and hours. She wanted to surprise him. She wanted to, go out with him for his birthday, but she found out that he was with her. So that's the first thing that she did. She damaged property of him. Eventually, kind of down the line, which we'll break down a little bit more, Betty actually lost custody of their children because Dan moved out of their house. He took their custody. He also got a restraining order against Betty. And then finally, after all of those things, after moving out, he finally admitted to having an affair with Linda, and he then filed for divorce. So kind of an overview of crimes. That was like not very specific of like a timeline, but those are kind of like, that's kind of how their marriage went. She took care of the kids. She put everything that she had into this relationship and into their life and into this housewife kind of dream that she had, while he, got the money and, obviously was having an affair. So she was very upset about this, but kind of what I wanted to do was break down the crimes before she actually got sentenced with her husband's and her husband's new wife murder. So what did she do before the murders? So I kind of just made a list here. She burned all of Dan's custom tailored suits. She left abusive messages at his answering machine. She became obsessed with his life because of her anger towards him. She broke into his house and vandalized the windows, walls, his clothing, etc. She actually drove her car straight into his front door. And, this was all about for like 7 years or even probably more, but she stalked Dan and Linda. This is really because, she felt like she was being terrorized by like them being in a relationship. I mean, even Linda would send her, things like face cream, aging cream, like she would send her messages as well, kind of, saying that she wasn't a good mother. And I think that also because Dan took away her children, she kind of felt like she was being attacked. But eventually she goes into the new couple's home and she shoots both of them. So she was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, double homicide, for killing both of them. And she also had 2 years for illegal use of a firearm added onto her sentence of 32 years to life in prison.
The theory we chose to help describe Betty Broderick's motives is frustration-aggression theory. First, what is frustration-aggression theory? Frustration-aggression theory states that aggressive behavior is likely the result of prior frustrations. Like we discussed in class lectures, there are socially acceptable ways to express and release aggression, including working out, playing violent video games, watching violent movies, stuff like that. Criminal behavior is an immediate aggressive release of stress, and the easier it is to access, the more likely an individual is to participate in it. A study, peer-reviewed, conducted in 1995, analyzed the effects that frustration justification on hostile aggression. The study involved participants being blocked from an expected gratification or reward in either a justified or unjustified way. And the results of the study found that the degree to which an individual feels their frustration is justified influences the degree of hostile aggression they feel and act on. How this theory applies to Betty Broderick. So frustration-aggression theory applies to Betty Broderick's case because all of the events leading up to her crime continuously increased her levels of frustration towards both her ex-husband Dan and his new wife Linda. Some examples of what they did that Betty felt personally attacked by and frustrated by included the fact that Dan made the legal process extremely difficult for Betty, and she felt that he also had an unfair advantage in the divorce trial because he was a practicing lawyer with connections as well. Dan also wound up receiving full custody of the kids and custody of the house. Whenever Betty called their home phone, she found out that Linda had changed the answering machine message to replace Betty with herself. Betty also had many accusations against Linda, including the idea that she thought Linda was sent her a threatening and taunting letter, as well as wrinkle cream and weight loss products in an effort to taunt Betty. She also accused Linda of stealing her wedding china and not returning it. Betty acted out aggressively at many points before the murder, as we previously mentioned, like leaving threatening messages on their phone and breaking into and vandalizing their home, etc. Even during the trials, Betty expressed that she felt her actions were justified because she was being silenced and controlled. She called the murders a, quote, desperate act of self-defense. And in reference to Dan, she said that, quote, he was killing me. So as a result of all this pent-up frustration caused by both the messy divorce and watching her ex-husband marry the woman he had an affair with, she thought that Linda was replacing her. She felt her kids were taken away from her, and her house was taken away from her, and her life was taken away from her. So she lost control and took her aggression out on what she saw as the causes of her frustration, Dan and Linda.
After examining Betty's background, her crimes, and how frustration-aggression theory plays into her situation, we wanted to look at the policy implications. What exactly could have prevented this crime from happening? Similar to what was said earlier, criminal behavior is the immediate release of anger and stress. For Betty, she turned to criminal behavior to release the anger that was built up during her marriage and after her divorce. The way Betty and her husband treated each other was abusive and toxic. Her husband, Dan, was constantly gaslighting her, took away her home, her children, and cheated on her. While Betty also had narcissistic and histrionic personality disorders and tended to act sporadically and in unhinged manners, meaning that their marriage was quite unstable. We looked at it from a sociological perspective. If both Betty and Dan could have received some sort of mental illness treatment or psychological help, the two of them could perhaps have learned better communication skills and better ways to treat each other with respect. Therefore, even if they did not stay married, their divorce could have been smooth and nonviolent. It was also important for us to look at the effects that Betty faced from being gaslit and experiencing emotional abuse for years in her marriage. If she could have received some sort of therapy that would help her talk through what she was going through and receive support from her community, she might not have felt so alone and felt the need to act in violent manners because she felt that there was no other way to release her anger. Like mentioned earlier, learning to communicate her anger in a controlled way could have made her act in ways that were more socially acceptable. For example, mentioned earlier, working out is a common way to reduce anger and stress, and it's socially acceptable, whereas criminal behavior is still a way to release your anger and stress, but it could actually build upon that anger and cause it to become worse, and it is illegal and socially unacceptable to act in that way. In a peer-reviewed study by Lewis and Butcher from 1992, their study found that anger catharsis is inappropriate because, as their research has shown, the expression of anger leads to increased anger. The anger response is reinforced rather than drained. This is interesting when comparing with Betty's situation because the way she acted leading up to the murders seemed to have continued to build her anger. If she released that prior anger in a different way rather than stalking and sending mean packages and driving her car through a building, she could have sought other ways to release that anger so it wouldn't have built up to end in murders. We also looked at sociological ways that this could have been prevented, how society could have been better structured to not allow this to happen. We talked about how young people should have been educated about healthy relationships in that time period and learn how to communicate with partners and not be able to control one or the other. We also talked about how the family structure of Betty's life made the marriage more complicated. Betty relied solely on Dan for her economic support, and when he left her with nothing, she felt more of the stress of having to fight for herself when she hadn't before. We also looked at healthier ways to express anger and frustration, similar to what we said before, like working out or doing other tasks that would be deemed socially acceptable as ways to release anger. Maybe these situations could have prevented the crime from being committed and helped both Betty and Dan recover themselves to treat each other better. These are the references used on our presentation. This was our presentation on Betty Broderick. Thank you for listening.